In your previous lesson, you learned how to use the second conditional and the structure "if I were you" to give advice to someone. So, here is my piece of advice for you. If I were you, I wouldn't miss this lesson. I would follow it very carefully. You're asking me why? Because we are going to further explore different ways of giving advice to someone. I'm pretty sure that most, if not all of you, like English and that you want to upgrade your English level. And that's exactly what we are working on. In this lesson, we will learn how and when to use the modals of advice: should, ought to, and had better. They are similar in meaning, but not exactly the same. Since you're already familiar with the modal verb should, we will start with it, and you will learn about the other two verbs, ought to and had better, by comparing them to should. So, let's get started. We use should and its negative form shouldn't, which is should not, to give advice or to say that something is a good or bad idea. For example, you should buy the blue sweatshirt. It suits you better than the green one, meaning the right thing to do is to buy the blue one. Let's see how we use the negative form. They shouldn't worry. It's not that important. We can, of course, use should in the question form to ask for advice. Should I read the instructions first? When we are giving unasked for advice, which means that no one has asked us for advice, it is polite to use phrases such as I think, maybe, or perhaps. I think you should grow your own vegetables. Maybe Mary should take the dog for a walk. He hasn't been out for too long. Perhaps he shouldn't eat so much. He will feel sick. In that way, we make our advice sound softer. Ne namećemo dakle svoje mišljenje, već služeći se izrazima I think, maybe i perhaps, dajemo učtiv i blag savjet, jer ga onaj kome ga upućujemo od nas nije ni tražio. Should can also be used to give recommendations. Your father should see that film. It's amazing. I don't think you should take your friends to that restaurant. Their food tastes horrible. U ovim primjerima should koristimo da bismo nekome nešto preporučili. S obzirom na to da živim u Nišu, ja vama preporučujem sljedeće. When you come to Niš, you should visit the Skull Tower and the fortress. And now I'm asking you for a recommendation. Is there a place that I should visit if I come to your hometown? Thank you. I hope I will see all those beautiful places soon. Here is another question for you. What kind of verb do we use after should? Have you paid attention to that? That's right. Use the bare infinitive, infinitive without to, after should. We say, you should ask. They shouldn't go. We don't say, you should to ask. They shouldn't to go. Now, it goes the same for our next modal verb, and that is ought to. I posle ought to ćete dakle upotrebiti infinitiv glagola bez to. So, we say, you ought to ask, they ought to go. And what do these sentences mean? What's the meaning of ought to? In meaning, ought to is exactly the same as should, which means that if you can use should in a sentence, you can also use ought to. You should buy the blue sweatshirt, or you ought to buy the blue sweatshirt. Your father should see that film, or your father ought to see that film. There is no difference in meaning. Što se značenja tiče, ought to i should, dakle, imaju isto značenje. There is no difference in meaning. However, there are some other differences between ought to and should. Ought to is more formal and less common in modern spoken English than should. Sentences with ought to sound a bit unnatural and old-fashioned, so you will probably use ought to only when you are writing and not in everyday speech. Ought to se dakle uglavnom koristi u zvaničnom, formalnom engleskom jeziku. Osim toga, ought to najčešće koristimo u potvrdnim rečenicama. We ought to do more exercise. Daleko ređe ćete ga sretati u odričnim i upitnim rečenicama poput ovih. You ought not to speak to your mother like this. Ought she to call the police? Again, these sentences sound very formal, so better use should in negative sentences and questions. Pokušajte sada da ove dve rečenice, odričnu i upitnu, izmenite tako što ćete u njima umesto ought to upotrebiti should. You should not speak to your mother like this. Or, you shouldn't speak to your mother like this. I upitna, should she call the police? And now, let's move on to had better. Had better ćete u govornom engleskom jeziku sretati i koristiti mnogo češće nego ought to. Pa je zato poželjno da se s ovim izrazom što bolje upoznate. What does had better actually mean? When we say you had better do something, we actually mean you should do something. However, It is a bit different from should, because when we use had better, it means that if you don't do something, something bad will happen. If you don't do it, there might be a problem or danger. So, had better is stronger than should. We use had better to give strong advice to someone, including yourself. We usually contract had better, which means that we shorten the word had, like this. I had better becomes I'd better. We had better, we'd better. You had better, you'd better. She had better, she'd better. He had better, he'd better. They had better, they'd better. This short form is much more natural in spoken English. Let's practice pronouncing it together. Please repeat after me. I'd better. We'd better. You'd better. She'd better. He'd better. They'd better. Ovo D je nenaglašeno i zato u bržem govoru ponekad jedva čujno. Another important thing about had better is this. Do not let the verb had confuse you. Had is a past tense verb, but when we use had better, we use it to talk about the present or the future, not about the past. Ne dajte dakle da vas had iz had better zbuni. Nema veze sa prošlim vremenom. Kada koristimo ovaj izraz, koristimo ga da bismo govorili o sadašnjosti ili budućnosti. And here is a piece of good news for you. Had better behaves in the same way as should and ought to. Remember, we said that we use the infinitive without to after should and ought to. It goes the same for had better. We say, I'd better ask. We'd better go. We don't say, I'd better to ask. We'd better to go. Let's have a look at some examples. My exam starts in 20 minutes. I'd better go and get ready. So, here a student is giving advice to himself or herself. Let's say it's she. She says, I'd better go and get ready. Which means that if she doesn't go and get ready, something bad might happen. There might be a problem. What can be the problem? Yes, you're right. If she doesn't go and get ready, she will be late for the exam, and the teacher or the professor might get angry, or she herself might get nervous if she doesn't get ready for the exam on time and then get a bad mark. What about the next example? It's very cold outside. You'd better dry your hair before you go out. Let's say that it's December. It's cold outside and you have just taken a shower and your hair is wet. Your mother advises you to dry your hair before you go out. She says, you'd better dry your hair before you go out. if you don't listen to her advice, something bad might happen. If you go out with wet hair in December, most probably you are going to catch a cold, aren't you? And the third example, there's someone moving about downstairs. We'd better call the police quickly. I think this one is not difficult for you to understand now. Rečenice u kojima koristimo had better, dakle nose snažnije značenje od onih u kojima savet nekome dajemo uz pomoć modalnog glagola should, jer nagoveštavaju da ukoliko osoba koja je savet upućen ne posluša taj savet, to može imati loše posljedice. Može doći do nekog problema ili opasnosti. Now, let's talk about the negative form. The negative form of had better is had better not. You had better not do something. And again, we contract the negative form just like the positive. Umjesto I had better not, najčešće kažemo I'd better not, we'd better not, you'd better not, she'd better not, he'd better not, they'd better not. This area looks quite dangerous. I'd better not stop here. Imagine a man driving through a dangerous neighborhood. He gives advice to himself because he thinks that it's not a good idea to stop the car there. Hurry up, you'd better not miss the last bus. Because if you miss the last bus, you will be in trouble. How will you get home in the middle of the night? The children had better not play football on this busy road. The cars drive down it very fast. Here we have a real danger. If the children continue to play football there, a car might hit and injure them. So the children had better not play football there. What about the question form? Teško da ćete ikada čuti ovako postavljeno pitanje. Had you better? Had better is not normally used in the ordinary question form, but it is sometimes used in the negative question form. Hadn't you better? Ovo je dakle već prihvatljivo. Na primjer, hadn't you better ask him first? Zar ne bi bilo bolje da najpre pitaš njega? And now, let's compare had better with should and point out differences between them once again. Number 1, Anne says, I don't feel well, and Peter gives her advice. You should stay in bed. Number 2, here Anne says, I have a fever, and Peter now reacts in a different way. He says, you'd better stay in bed. What's the difference? Think about this for a while. That's right. The second situation is more serious than the first one. Anne has a fever. If she doesn't stay in bed, her condition might get even worse. That's why Peter uses had better to advise her what to do. His advice is thus stronger than the first one with should. You should stay in bed. Ostani u krevetu. Trebalo bi da ostaneš u krevetu. You'd better stay in bed. Bolje bi bilo da ostaneš u krevetu, da se ne bi još ozbiljnije razbolela. So, this is urgent advice. And here is another pair of sentences to compare. You should finish everything today. You'd better finish everything today. Can you tell the difference now? Well, when I say you should finish everything today, I think it's better if you finish everything today, but not really necessary. It's up to you to decide. But if I say you'd better finish everything today, I'm suggesting that if you don't do what I say, something bad might happen. For example, you had better finish everything today or you will lose your job. Još jednom, savjeti koji dajemo sa had better nose mnogo snažniju poruku od onih u kojima koristimo should. And now, to practice what you have just learned, let's do a quiz. There are 8 questions for you to answer. Think carefully and choose the right answer. Are you ready? Good luck. Number 1. When we give advice, should and ought to have the same meaning. Is this true or false? That's right. It's true. Which of the following sentences is the least polite? Perhaps you should buy a better car. I think you should buy a better car. You should buy a better car. Maybe you should buy a better car. Which one is the least polite? Right. It's you should buy a better car. Rekli smo da kada želimo da ublažimo svoj savjet ili kada ga niko od nas nije tražio, da je poželjno koristiti izraze poput perhaps, I think, maybe. What do we use when we want to give strong or urgent advice? Should, ought to, or had better? Had better. Which is the most common way to ask the following question? Had we better try any of the local dishes? Ought we to try any of the local dishes? Should we try any of the local dishes? Sjetite se, rekli smo da nečiji savjet ili nečiju preporuku za nešto tražimo najčešće uz pomoć modalnog glagola should. Should we try any of the local dishes? You're planning a surprise birthday party for your best friend. You say to yourself, I'd better to invite all of our friends on time. I'd better invited all of our friends on time. I'd better invite all of our friends on time. Or I'd better not invite all of our friends on time. What do you say to yourself? That's right. I'd better invite all of our friends on time. Četvrta rečenica je gramatički također prihvatljiva i ispravna, ali ne bi bila smislena. A rekli smo da posle I'd better, I had better koristimo infinitiv glagola bez to. Jenny has a winning lottery ticket for £10,000. She had better not lost the ticket, lose the ticket, to lose the ticket, losing the ticket. She had better not do what? She had better not lose the ticket. I u odričnom obliku posle had better not koristimo infinitiv bez to. Which of the two statements makes sense? You ought to apply for that course. It sounds interesting. You had better apply for that course. It sounds interesting. Which of the two statements makes sense? You ought to apply for that course. It sounds interesting. Ovdje neko nekome preporučuje da se prijavi za određeni kurs ili možda za slušanje određenog predmeta na fakultetu iz prostog razloga što deluje zanimljivo. Nema dakle nikakve opasnosti niti mogućnosti da bude nekog problema. Ovo je prosto preporuka, savet. You ought to apply for that course because it sounds interesting. And the last question for you in this quiz. In the sentence, it's late. We'd better go. With is a contraction. What is with short for? We should, we would, we did, or we had. We'd better go. What is with short for? That's right. We had. What's your score? Hopefully 8 out of 8 stars. Or higher than 5 out of 8. Congratulations. If it's lower than that, then you should, ought to, had better watch this lesson one more time and make sure you understand the difference between should, ought to, and had better. And the next step for you is homework. For your homework, you should choose one of the 2 tasks. Or, even better, if you want to do this, you can do both of them. Let's see task number 1. What is the best advice you've ever got? What about the worst one? Setite se dakle najboljeg saveta koji ste ikada od nekoga dobili, a razmislite koji je bio najgori. What is the best advice you've ever given to someone? What about the worst one? Najbolji savjet koji ste ikada nekome dali, a ima najgori? Try to remember the exact words and write them down in English. Now, let's look at your second task. Your brother complains to you that another student is bullying him and asks you, "What should I do?" Think carefully about that serious problem and tell him what you think he should, ought to, had better do. Write down your exact words. Šta biste, dakle, savjetovali svom bratu koji se, nažalost, sreo sa nečim protiv čega svi mi treba da se borimo, a to je nasilničko ponašanje? That's the end of our lesson. Thank you for your attention. And here is another piece of advice for you. Never stop learning. Not only from us, your teachers, but also from everyday life situations. I'm looking forward to meeting you next time. Goodbye.